Hello, and welcome to this conversation on our online interview series, CBGA FTC Dialogues on Global Financial Transparency. Today, we have with us Alfonso Daniels, who's a journalist and researcher, and will be speaking to us on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, and on a report that he co-authored on the topic for the Financial Transparency Coalition. Alfonso Daniels is a Spanish researcher and investigative journalist based in London. He has worked on several environmental and human rights crime investigations for organizations including Financial Transparency Coalition, Overseas Development Institute, and Changing Markets Foundation, as well as media outlets such as BBC World Service, Telegraph, and El Mundo. Among others, he was one of the main authors of an FTC report on major companies involved in IUU fishing and links to illicit financial flows, investigated foreign-owned fish meal plants in West Africa and their involvement in the destruction of local fishing stocks for changing markets, and worked on an investigation on large corporations blocking single-use plastic legislation. Welcome to this conversation, Alfonso. So my first question is, can you tell us what this report is about and what are some of the main issues that it addresses?
Thank you very much for having me in this conversation, Sarah. The report is, as you said, it's on, and especially the links between IUU fishing, illegal fishing, etc., with illicit financial flows, and also to try to uncover those behind these essentially illicit activities. And until now, the whole debate has really been on the environmental and development side. But what we wanted to do with this report was expanding it to the financial side and make a point that there is a clear and very strong link with IFFs and strong link with the lack of beneficial ownership transparency, and that's important to tackle the issue of IUU fishing. Otherwise, it's very difficult to be able to tackle this issue and resolve this problem. Just to remind you, you did a bit of an introduction of the importance of IUU fishing, but just to remind you that IUU fishing also accounts for almost estimated up to a fifth of global fish catches in the world. That's compounding the issue of overfishing that's taking on. And it's happening in places where you have mainly in places where you have very weak governance structures, like many countries in Asia, many countries in Africa, West Africa particularly. And all these countries are also especially impacted by climate change. So this is compounding a crisis that's an underlying crisis. And also it's important to take into account that IUU fishing generates up to 23.5 billion direct losses for mostly global South countries. So it's a massive issue, and it's a massive financial issue that we wanted to address.
Thanks. So what have been some of the findings in this report, and why are these findings significant?
We put together this list of 972 vessels reported, that's industrial and semi-industrial vessels, reported to be involved in IUU fishing between January 2010 and May 2022 from various sources, official sources, reputed NGOs, reputed media outlets, and regional fisheries management organizations, that's RFMOs. That's 4 times more than the combined IUU list of vessels from the RFMOs. It's a massive list, one of the largest in the world. And the findings were very striking. The first finding is that the amount of IFFs linked to IUU fishing goes in billions of dollars every year. That's around 11.5 billion just for Africa alone. And for West Africa, it's around 9.49 actually billion a year. That's a massive amount. In Indonesia, the estimate is that it's 4 billion. That's a huge figure as well, and around 2 billion, say, for countries like Argentina. So again, it's compounding. It's money essentially stolen from those countries that are facing huge crisis as it is. We also found that the beneficial ownership information, despite using the best databases in the world, we only found some shareholders, some beneficial ownership information for 16% of companies, of vessels accused of being involved in IU fishing. And we found around 40% of legal ownership information for those vessels. That highlights the massive gap in information on beneficial ownership information, and how the owners of these vessels often use complex corporate structures to hide their identities. And that, for example, you see it in Ghana. For instance, there was an investigation. Ghana bans, because of sustainability issues, the operation of foreign fishing vessels, commercial vessels in its waters. But then an investigation found that 90% of the supposedly Ghanaian vessels operating in their waters are actually owned by Chinese companies. We also found in this investigation what we think are the top 10 companies involved in this illicit trade. They together represent around 23% of all cases of IU fishing in this data set. And that shows that there's quite a big concentration of this problem in the hands of few companies. 8 of them were Chinese, one of them was from Colombia, and another from Spain. The interesting thing, going back a moment to beneficial ownership information, is that BO data was available for Asian vessels for 50%, around 50% of those vessels. And the proportion goes further down, say around 40% for European vessels, then and up to only 3% for African vessels. That again highlights that Asia possibly is a bit more open about BO data, and Africa is the opposite. And that's partly, as I said before, and partly because of the explanation why many foreign companies are actually hiding their true identities and operating as African companies. So, and other findings were that a third of IU vessels that we found were flying Chinese flags. And this is important because China has the largest distant water fishing fleet in the world. So it's a big percentage in their hands. And also, but this problem affects flags are also their Spanish flags, Taiwanese flags, etc. And around 9%, interestingly, around 9% fly so-called flags of convenience. That's flags where essentially there's very weak controls over their operations. So that's why these vessels choose these so-called FOCs to operate. So it's quite a lot of, and those are just a few of the findings that we found, but that just gives you an idea of, again, the scale of links of IU fishing with IFFs, and also the scale of and the degree to which these companies behind this illicit trade are willing to go to hide their true identity.
Thanks. So what are some of the challenges that you faced while working on this issue specifically?
Some of the challenges, I mean, there are a lot of challenges that we faced, but one of the main challenges we faced was putting this list together. There, as I said, there is the combined IU list, which is managed by the regional fisheries manager organizations, but that's a very political list. Vessels come in and out, and for political reasons, sometimes they're extracted, so it doesn't really reflect the problem. So we used partly that list, but we built one which ended up being more than 4 times larger than that combined list, which is the most accepted one. But that was a big challenge, and we took investigators to help us, and also our own members from FTC helped us. Very few countries are open about this IU list. Some of the countries that were open, interestingly, was China until around 2019. And you have Guinea and Argentina, but most of the countries keep this information secret. They would not share it. Then the other problem that we faced was uncovering beneficial ownership data of the vessels that we identified at the time of the reported offenses. And when we used for that, the best data sets available. And again, it was a very hard process. And even for that, we found just, as I said, only 16% of information for some shareholder information on those vessels. And that's, as I mentioned, because these owners are keen to hide their identity through complex corporate structures. And what we find difficult now is keep making the point across to the development world and to the environmental world and the financial transparency world that all these things are linked together, and they have, we all have to work together to resolve these issues. Not just environmental, it's not just development, it's not just financial, it's a combination of the three. So those are the main things that we found as challenges.
My next question is that can you explain the interlinkage between financial transparency and illegal fishing? And how is IUU fishing an illicit financial flow, as the report mentions? And how can financial transparency in particular help to curb or end illegal and IUU fishing?
The interlinkages are very close. You have the Ocean Panel identifying ownership transparency as one of the key parts to resolve the problem of IUU fishing in Africa, specifically said, and globally, and in Asia, etc. Yet beneficial ownership information is rarely, if ever, collected when licensing a vessel or getting a registration for the vessel or being able to fish or operate with the vessel. So there's a massive gap there. And what happens is that because we don't know, essentially, we don't know who the owners of these vessels are, the ones who normally are punished are the crew or the captains of those vessels. And the fines are very small as a result. So those who are owners of these vessels go about unscathed, and fines are not an issue for them. They do not, they're not worried or concerned about what repercussions there will be against them, and they continue operating completely free. There's no repercussion for them. So that's the linkage. We have financial transparency is key to uncover those behind these operations. Unless that's done, these people will continue working and operating illegally or engaged in fishing. And what's worryingly, especially worryingly, is that despite all of this, you have fisheries has been largely ignored in international transparency natural resource architecture. I mean, you have EITI, FATF, there are several initiatives, international initiatives, that are pushing for financial transparency in the natural resources sector. But these initiatives are ignoring IUU fishing, are ignoring the fishery sector. They're mostly focused on mining or illegal logging, timber, etc. But fishing is a major gap in that structure. You have the FITI, it's an initiative to bring transparency as well from countries directly linked to fisheries. However, this initiative, very few countries have joined, and it only asks for the status of transparency, beneficial ownership transparency from those countries. So it basically lacks teeth. Then you have making matters even worse. You have the European Court of Justice in November 2022 ruling against making public registries, beneficial ownership registries, public. So they ruled against that provision, and that makes even harder to find, and will make harder to find the BO data of the companies or the vessels involved in IUU fishing. And that's harder done by Europe. So it's sending a really negative sign to the rest of the world about beneficial ownership transparency. What's interesting is one of the main companies that we identified accused of being involved in IUU fishing was a Spanish company. And we could not find, even though it is a very large company, and it received millions of dollars, millions of euros from the European community, the European Union, and the Spanish government, we could not find their beneficial owners. We could not find their shareholders. When we spoke to the company registry, they were telling us we can only reveal this information. This information is only available at the time the company was instituted or registered, but there's no use for us. We need to know when the shareholders of the company at the time of the alleged offenses. So those are the links, and those are kind of the challenges that we face.
My last question is, what are some of the recommendations in the report, and what, according to you, is the way forward?
key really is to determine fisheries as a high-risk sector for beneficial ownership registries. That means that they should, that information of who the owners of these vessels are should be included in registries and with a low threshold to report beneficial ownership, ideally no threshold whatsoever. But what's really key as well, Sarah, is to include these in the, as I mentioned, in the key extractive industry financial transparency initiatives that you have, and which is not at the moment. That, for example, includes the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, EITI, and also FATF. Fisheries has to be included there as an extractive sector that needs the same level of financial transparency as the other sectors. Then you need to include fisheries crimes along with other environmental crimes as predicate offenses for money laundering. That is, anything illegal that generates proceeds that are then laundered. That would enable the use of anti-money laundering legislation, and that would be able to, for authorities to be able to target those owners of IUU vessels more effectively and punish them for their behavior, for what they're doing. What is really important is that you should also require beneficial ownership data when requesting a fishing license or fishing authorization, and that is not really happening at the moment. When you register a vessel, no one is really asking you who the beneficial ownership of the company is. You just need to give the legal owner. So we have one of the main companies, for example, that we identified as being accused of being involved in IUU fishing. It's from Panama. And that company, what appears as the beneficial owner of that legal company, is also the owner of more than 1,000 other companies. So clearly, this is part of possibly a legal office, which represents a lot of companies, again, to hide the beneficial owner. So that information needs to be requested at the time of registering vessels. You also have to have governments and authorities publishing up-to-date lists of IUU vessels and the beneficial owners, and increase the fines and sanctions. At the moment, those lists, as I mentioned, are secret. We do not know them, and they will only share them through the Regional Fisheries Management Organization system, but that's a very political one. So that information should be open and should be available for all to see. And then you have, but this is like a chain. You're tackling one part of the chain, but you need to tackle all the other parts as well in order for it to work. So, for example, you have the fisheries agreements. Many of these fisheries agreements, say, for example, in West Africa, with particularly Chinese and Russian fleets, are secret. We don't know who's being allowed to fish what. So all that information, all those fisheries agreements should be made public, should be known by everyone. Also, automatic identification systems by vessels should be enforced, and the vessels should be required to always have AIS connected. That means that we know where they are at any given time. What happens normally is that many vessels are entering the territorial waters or or marine protected areas, and they go dark. They disconnect the AIS. That needs to be stopped, and fines should be increased generally. But so what's interesting is that these issues and these measures have been spoken about quite a lot, many of them, and not that complicated to implement. And in my opinion, there is a lack of political will to make those changes. These are not costly measures. These are quite obvious measures to make. And again, and they should be, there's no reason why they should not be done. What's interesting and I think highlights the issue is that a few months after we released the report last year, in October last year, one of the main companies, the main company in the list, a Chinese company called Pingtan, was sanctioned by the US government and delisted from the NASDAQ. That's a major step forward, and that comes after many years of other organizations campaigning against Pingtan and denouncing what this company was doing. However, soon after that happened, the Chinese government came and condemned the action by the US government and called it was a political move. So you have, again, China, one of the key players, actually sort of undermining a positive step that was done. However, on the other hand, you have the other companies that have been denounced and are being denounced and are in our list, some of them European, and nothing has happened against them. So that also would suggest that maybe the US is only targeting the Chinese companies, not really caring about the others, therefore not that concerned about EU fishing as a illicit activity, really. So there is, across the board, a lack of political will, in my opinion, to tackle this. And financial transparency needs to be at the heart of the measures to tackle this. And again, these are not difficult measures, they are not costly measures, and there's really no reason why this should not be done. And just to add one last thing is there are some positive developments, and the Royal United Service Institute think tank came out very recently with a global scan, what to look for in the next 10 years in terms of IUU fishing. What are the trends? And we participated as FTC in that process, and financial transparency came out as the second trend among more than 100 trends. That will guide policymakers, that will guide funders in the next 10 years. So that's a massive step. So there's slow movement towards recognizing the issue, recognizing the problem. But again, these are steps that are, I think, way taking too long for what we're facing, for the crisis we're facing, and really much more needs to be done much faster.